Hi, everyone, and welcome to this is about the 58th podcast that I've recorded and that you'll probably hear on the Financial Modeling Podcast. But it's the first ever video podcast. And I'm sure there's a better name for it than video podcast, but nevertheless, it's a video podcast. And joining me today, and the reason why we're actually doing a video podcast is because we're going to be doing a live demo of Thomas Paul's new dynamic scenario manager, which I'm really excited to see. You would have heard about it if you tuned into the Financial Modeling Summit and listened to the Financial Modeling Innovation Awards. But it's some really interesting stuff, and I think especially when it comes to projects and financial models where you have to run many different scenarios, such as infrastructure projects, it certainly makes a huge difference. So hi Thomas, and thanks very much for joining us on the podcast today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
So Thomas, tell us a bit about the background. I mean, season 3 of the podcast, as you know, focuses on the tools and technologies that makes financial modelers' lives easier. And your tool certainly makes financial modelers' lives easier.
I'm certainly very interested in that type of topic. So I've been financial modeling now a good 10 years, probably longer. Always trying to find a new way of doing things that just makes both my life easier and anyone else involved around me. Which is really how this whole innovation came about, that I thought there must be a better way of doing scenario managers. I'd done them previously with VBA and all the traditional ways, and I just thought there must be something better. And when I remember the first time I saw a data table, I just went, wow, this is such a powerful tool that have we been given within Excel, and I just wanted to find a way, how could we combine the two? I didn't like that there was a limitation of 1 or 2 variables per data table. I thought there must be a way of doing it better.
And I guess data tables, it's not a new thing when it comes to scenario analysis. But I guess one of the big issues with data tables is that a lot of the complaints that you'll hear is that it makes people's workbooks slow, it bloats workbooks, you recalculate and it takes forever. So how did you get around some of those challenges?
Sure. I suppose it's definitely a valid concern with using data tables that it does increase the size of it. But I think if you're smart with how you structure them and you limit the number of them, so there's only perhaps one, it makes things a lot easier. I've certainly built models in the past where I've had a couple dozen data tables and the thing is just as slow as anything. So having this table that can run multiple scenarios all in a single place with a single data table, I haven't encountered any major performance issues in a sense with the financial model compared to other ways. It's faster than VBA and being dynamic and live, you don't have to worry about clicking buttons. So I find that while it's certainly not as fast as if you didn't have a data table at all, the speed issues are not, I haven't found any material issues. That being said, I'm sure someone will be able to apply it to an absolutely monster model and find some performance issues, but it's always a trade-off between convenience and performance.
Well, let's dive into the demo. So for people listening to the podcast that aren't looking at their screen at the moment, talk to us a bit about the Dynamic Scenario Manager. Talk to us a bit about it. I mean, you've got a great calculation diagram there, which I absolutely love. It kind of lays out the model map in a nice visual format. But talk to us a bit about it, and specifically talk to us a bit about the difference between this and a typical VBA type solution, right? I mean, you're talking to somebody who's a bit of a VBA junkie. I'll put my hand up and I'll admit it, I'm addicted to VBA. You kind of will give me in my previous life, you'd give me the most basic model ever, and I'd find a way to incorporate some VBA into it. But you're talking probably to an audience and listening to the podcast, if they've really got into the depths of Scenario Manager, they've probably delved into VBA. So how is this different, and what are the advantages of this versus a VBA-based solution?
Sure. So I suppose the big difference between the two is it kind of removes that step that often in VBA calculations you have of changing the scenario number, recalculating the model, and then copying and pasting the values. That's a very traditional way of doing it in VBA. Most of us, it's probably one of the first things we learn how to do in VBA in our financial modeling careers, just because it's such a handy way and such a great use of VBA. However, what this does is it uses data tables to replace that core functionality of the VBA by, in a very similar structure to a VBA scenario manager, it sets up all your inputs, which I'll come to in a second. It sets up all your inputs into different profiles or columns. by scenario, and then using the power of the data table, it runs each one of those inputs through the calculations, not quite simultaneously, which comes back to that calculation performance issue, but nearly simultaneously, that you don't need to hit recalculate if you've got data tables enabled. It just automatically flows through. So in terms of the calculation flow, what you see here is a little bit different maybe to some other scenario managers, is that you have key inputs and other inputs. Now they can be on either the scenario manager page itself or in other input pages. The scenario manager itself, then using numbering system, selects the active one and passes active inputs, so the key inputs, through to the core calculations. Now, in my model, it's a very simple set of financial calculations just to come up with some cash flows. But literally, this could be any type of financial model we do. Wide range. There could be operational models. There could be anything, really. It's whatever you want to try and run this through. These calculations, the outputs of them are then fed back to the scenario manager page, to the data table, which is where the magic really happens. And that's really where that VBA swap out is instead of copy pasting results into a results location, it does that all on the scenario manager page, which I can show you in a minute. Then finally, the outputs are then linked to either the calculations themselves directly, if you just want to have a look at the single scenario, or linked to that data table, that results output table, the same as a VBA one, where you can select multiple scenarios to look at side by side. But the difference being that it's dynamic. So if you want to go back and change an input, it's just a matter of changing it, and away you go, and it automatically updates, which instead of having to remember that and click that button, I think we've all been in that case where the deadline is rapidly approaching, you have to get a report out the door, and you realize after you've hit send that you didn't hit update. So half your sensitivities are not consistent with your base case anymore. Very frustrating and difficult experience to have to explain to the client, to your managers. This avoids that, or reduces the risk of that immensely by having it automatically calculating at any given time. But I can take you through. It probably makes more sense walking through it. But I thought this calculation diagram can help those who are visually minded to have a look at it and try and understand how this financial model is set up.
I think this calculation diagram is great, and I've never quite seen actually one laid out like this in Excel before, but I love it because it clearly shows what's happening in each different part of the model and where the numbers are flowing through. So I think it's great. But yeah, let's dive into the scenario manager. I can't wait to see it.
Sounds great. So just to start with the scenario manager, now this will probably be familiar to people that have used VBA ones in the past, that it all runs basically off a scenario number across the top. So in this spreadsheet, on this worksheet, each column represents a different scenario. So in my case, I've set up 2 base cases, which I've called option 1, option 2, very original naming. But the next bit is then where you can start doing sensitivities, worst case, best case options. Now, the bit I've found useful when we work on a lot of projects, you often have multiple reference projects. So there might be 2 or 3 core project options that we want to look at, but we want to be able to sensitize different bits. So what we actually do is we say what reference project is the scenario linked to. Why this is important is if we come down to the next bit is, you'll see here for weighted cost of capital or growth profiles, I've only entered inputs in the 2 reference projects. I haven't had to enter anything over here. Basically what the formula over here does, if I expand it a bit for those watching along, is basically I've done a little bit of a lookup function that says if the scenario I'm looking at, so say I was looking at scenario 4 and scenario 4 was active in that box here. Actually, let's do that. Let's set that to scenario 4.
While you're doing that, I just want to make a note here. This is so key. Okay, to anybody building a financial model, this is so key, and I love this for a number of reasons. Because firstly, your weighted cost of capital over there, somebody could actually go and change one down the line, and then somebody looking at the scenario table could think, well, this is, the outputs are linked to the same weighted cost of capital that we're using for all of them, but it's actually not. This makes it very clear that you've only got 2 reference or base case scenarios that are being referenced. And secondly, I think it just makes it so simple that you've got two cases and then you can flex either of those cases. And I love that. I think that's really simply and well laid out.
I really wanted here to reduce the number of input cells that needed to be entered. I didn't want to have something that goes like equals this and then drag it across. That Excel is smarter than that if we let it to be. So in this case, I've used an isBlank and a lookup function to basically say if there's nothing entered, pick up which reference project value it should be. So only really columns G and H, the two reference projects, have to have an input in. Otherwise, it can be blank. But what the other great advantage of this is it's very quick to see in a scenario what's actually being flexed. So in this case, my best case and worst case, I've selected the high growth profiles for revenue and the low ones for my costs. And it's very quick to see, but you can very quickly tell as well, I haven't changed my weighted cost of capital. So really, hopefully, I think it's a nice and simple way of doing it and makes it a very clean worksheet. Particularly, again, if you're just quickly trying to change something at the last minute in your project, you've got a deadline coming up, very quick and easy. So I basically do the same thing for all the different inputs. The growth profiles is an example where sometimes you want to change multiple inputs at a single time instead of having to change every single year, for example. So I have a separate page called profiles where it's just high, medium, low. But this could be any sort of different calculations. And it could be, I've done annual profiles, but it could be a whole set. It could be a cost plan on building infrastructure. It could be I want to use cost plan 1 or cost plan 2. All it is a quick lookup on this page that says medium, and then something on my calculations page that uses a sum if or something across those profiles to pick up the right growth profile. So more inputs. The only other unique ones are probably the general sensitivities, where this is where we can add plus or minus 10%, 5%, whatever you want to test. But by default, that means the option 1 and 2 have to be 0. And then we pick up the 10. So here's a good example where we are looking at option 4, but there's nothing in option 4 all the way down till here. And now we're finally getting a unique value coming through. And that's where the difference is with the main case. So before I get to the data table, the next step is each one of this active column is actually what drives all the calculations on the calculations page. So this is where you would hook up anything you need in your model. So here, for example, we have the active values that pick up the growth rates. That's linked straight to the scenario manager, so it flexes dynamically. Same with the inputs over here. Now, structurally, you can structure this however you want. It's not a matter. I've just put it in this column as a way of cleanly seeing where the inputs are coming from, but they could be located left to right to left. Not a major deal for the purposes of this. Finally, then that all comes out to a output table. Again, a very simplified P&L, simplified cash flow and PV with discount factor using my WACC. If I go back to the scenario manager, then what you'll see here is after a few labels, just for purposes of making sure we're picking up the right thing, I've then got all the outputs. Now, one limitation of the data table is that you do have to do time series down the page as opposed to across the page, but it's manageable with a bit of sum ifs and some labeling there. So what this is showing is these are actually my revenue, unit sale revenue, annual amounts for each scenario. Now, if you go across the page, you can start seeing that these numbers change depending on which sensitivity we're looking at, or scenario, if you like. So the data table itself is this area here with the key outputs from the financial model here down the page. And then the same scenario numbers up the top. So if you look at the data table itself, it's referencing F15 up here. So you can see very much that it's driven all of the scenario. The scenario number itself becomes all important, which in this case, I've connected to a drop-down menu to make life easy for the user and the data on the outputs. So you get a very dynamic, so that's where this kind of back and forth in the scenario calculation hopefully makes a little bit more sense, that we come back and forth to the scenario manager first for the inputs, and then we come back to the outputs, and probably a key reason I designed this diagram to show off how that works.
So let me
Probably
ask a
the
question here.
Yeah.
Thomas, just let me just interject with a question. Let's assume somebody that's watching the podcast wants to use this dynamic scenario manager. How do they go about doing it? Is it in the form of an Excel add-in, or how do they start using this tool?
Sure. So I've got an example happy to share with the people that are interested. But basically, the easiest way to set this, so you don't need any Excel add-ins, you don't need nothing. It all comes out of the box, which I quite like and makes it easy for sending to clients. The best way to do it is to basically have your calculations all ready to go with your inputs clearly identified. Then you add in a scenario manager like this one, where you then go through and hook up all your inputs back to these. So for example, if you had an input on your calculation page or somewhere or another input page that said 10% is my WACC, you make that equal the same row over here on the input page. So then you start getting that, you make your inputs a little bit more flexible. Finally, down the bottom, you then set up a scenario table like this, hook up your key outputs. Now, again, coming back to that performance question, you have to make sure you're only putting through the key items you actually want to check. So for example, in this one, I've put through pretty much all the high-level output totals. Now, you're definitely going to have things like NPV or EBITDA, depending on your model, but you may not be able to go down to the nth degree of your calculation. So you have to be a little bit strategic on that. But basically, if I delete the data table, it's then as simple as selecting selecting the scenario numbers across the top, outputs down the side, and going to data, what if analysis, select data table, and set your row input cell back to your scenario number. So in my case, F15. Once I hit OK, Excel runs, populates this area with a dynamic array table, and you're done. And then hooking it up to the outputs is the final piece where you can have an active scenario section, very much like a traditional dashboard, which is just hooked up to straight to your calculations. Or you can then start using sum ifs across the range. So for example, my NPV, what this does is it actually goes, okay, this is my NPV row in my data table. Then using numbering based on the scenario number you want to show, it will then sum if and bring across all your results dynamically. You then build some pretty cool tables like sensitivity tornado charts, scenario comparisons, all again, which are live, that if I just quickly here demonstrate that by changing my, I'm going to say my price per unit, instead of being $1.12 is now $1.20. If I go to my outputs table, you can see all the revenues, all the numbers increase automatically. I didn't have to click any buttons, didn't have to worry about it. Calculated pretty quickly, barely noticeable. So hopefully that was that makes life, I think, a lot easier on this, that you don't have to worry as much.
Absolutely. I think this is great. So somebody who's watching this and wants to start using your dynamic scenario manager, how do they get hold of it? Do they have to get in contact with you? Can they purchase it online? How do they get the tool?
I'm happy just to share a copy. I have learned over the years so much from different Excel forums, websites, podcasts, webinars, different things about Excel, and I'm very much in favor of sharing. I think it's one of the best things about the Excel and financial modeling community and wider, that no one is overly precious about their intellectual property. It's all about sharing and check out this cool new thing I found. So I'm very much in that camp of, I didn't invent data tables. I didn't invent scenario management. I just put the two together. So very happy to share how I've done that with other people. So yeah, I'm more than happy for people to get in contact with me. Probably via LinkedIn is the best way. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. And that's very generous of you. And I think you're right. I think there's great Excel community out there, and we all do share tools and we're very collaborative. So, likewise on my website, people can go and download tools showing people how to debt sculpt and etc. And I think that's really great that you've decided to make this a collaborative joint effort and really share your tool that you've developed with the Excel community. So thank you for that.
And I'm very much hoping someone can pull it apart and find even something even better from it. And I think that's always the best thing, that seeing what people can do with your tools and say, oh, have you tried doing this and improving it? So one of those, and I hope if they do, they share it with everyone.
So Thomas, my final question to you before we wrap up this is an amazing segment, and I think really you have to this is one of those tools that you have to start playing around with to understand where it can be used and how you can adapt it to your own models. What's your roadmap for the tool? What changes do you see coming to the tool in the future?
I haven't got a roadmap per se. I'm always just very interested in it. Finding new evolutions. This would be, I would have lost count how many times I've made small little changes or updates to it through the process. A good example of that is the lookup function built in here that picks up, allows you for blank spaces. Performance is probably definitely a big element that it would be nice to see if there was a way of improving it even more so. The other way would probably be selecting scenarios when comparing it. So at the moment, it's fairly manual in terms of numbers. Now, you could do it using drop-down menus, as I have done here, but I'm sure there's other ways. The final way is more, I'm very interested to see what other type of output we can produce from this, that now we have all these numbers live, dynamic calculating. How can we do that through here? And present it in a way that makes it easy for users and decision makers to get a grasp on what is the most important bit for their business. So at the end of the day, it's all well and good if you have the world's best financial model, but if it hasn't got good reporting or dashboarding attached to it, it's, in my mind, fairly useless.
It really just makes working through a dashboard, working through a financial model, working through any sort of financial report so much easier for decision makers to quickly identify, okay, this is a key component. This is a key input that I need to maybe go and negotiate on for a lower price, because this will have the biggest impact on the NPV or IRR. So I think those kind of inputs are very key for anybody, whether you're a finance manager or running a project sponsor, whatever the case might be. That's very key. Thomas, I think this is an amazing piece of work, and thank you very much for sharing it with me and with the Excel community.
Not a problem. Happy to share.